Happy Prince, the Wildes of Dublin and County Mayo. My name is Christine Keneally. I'm a Professor of History and Founding Director of Ireland's Great Hunger Institute at Quinnipiac University. Welcome. So this event today actually arose out of an exhibition co-curated with Matthew Squiert, which unfortunately was due to open the same week that the university closed. So with help from a few of our friends, we decided to make it online. Tello, our director, Tello McConnell, came up with an Oscar Wilde-ism. To rephrase, we are all in cyberspace now, but some of us are looking at the stars. If anything goes wrong today, please bear that in mind. Let's look at the stars. And somebody posed the question, what would Oscar Wilde think of an online program? Well, I think he would like it because, according to W.B. Yeats, there was no better talker or conversationalist than Oscar Wilde. So that is your choice. So with that said, welcome, and a particular warm welcome to my great friend and co-curator, Matthew Squiert. Matthew, are you there?
Yes, hi Christine, and hi everyone. Thank you all for being here in this kind of our strange COVID times, but we're all together, and I'm really lucky to work with Christine and Turlo in doing this. Just a little bit about me. I'm a PhD student at the University of Rochester, studying English with a focus on 19th century literature. Currently, I'm in New Jersey right now, but it's been amazing to get to work with Christine and then to talk more about Wilde and his family, and I look forward to just starting our discussion today.
Okay, thank you, Matthew. So maybe I should say about myself, I'm actually a historian, an Irish historian. I trained at Trinity College in Dublin. My family are Mayo, so I'm very excited about that. And I moved to America, I think 12, 13 years ago. And my great interests are the Great Hunger and Irish abolition and Oscar Wilde, so things that unite us. So during these 6 programs, we're going to look at Oscar through various prisms, the prism of his nationalism, of his feminism, of his literary achievements. Today, though, we're going to look at him through the prism of his father, William. But we want to start off by framing this program using Oscar's own words. And we're looking at Oscar's happy childhood, and we think it's appropriate to borrow from Oscar's book, The Happy Prince. So at this point, I'd like to introduce you to the accomplished actress, author, and director based in London and New York, Jenny Sterling, who is going to read part of The Happy Prince.
High above the city, on a tall column, stood the statue of the Happy Prince. He was gilded all over with thin leaves of fine gold. For eyes, he had 2 bright sapphires, and a large red ruby glowed on his sword hilt. He was very much admired indeed. "He is as beautiful as a weathercock," remarked one of the town councillors, who wished to gain a reputation for having artistic tastes. "Only not quite so useful," he added, fearing lest people should think him unpractical, which he really was not. "Why can't you be like the Happy Prince?" asked a sensible mother of her little boy who was crying for the moon. "The Happy Prince never dreams of crying for anything." "I am glad there is someone in the world who is quite happy," muttered a disappointed man as he gazed at the wonderful statue.
Thank you, Jenny. And if anybody hasn't read Oscar's children's stories, I would encourage you to do so. They are absolutely exquisite, the stories and the illustrations. So back to William and to Oscar's childhood. Matthew, would you like to tell us a bit about William Wilde to place him in context for us, please?
Yes, so it's one thing, I think, when you talk about Oscar Wilde, you tend to forget, I think, about his family and how illustrious that they truly were. And, you know, one person in particular, his father, is usually, again, we'll talk about this later, but kind of left out of his life in that he doesn't really appear in any of his works. It's, you know, his mother is, it seems to be, or at least, you know, a female influence seems to be in a lot of his works, particularly his plays. But his father was very much a kind of Renaissance man of Ireland and Dublin in particular. He was born in 1819 in Roscommon, and as he grew up there, he seemed to be very much connected to the land. He had, at that time in the early 19th century, there was still this idea of kind of an antiquarianism, a kind of a look to the past, and this kind of resurgence in Irish folklore, Irish myth, things of that nature. And with William Wilde himself, he was very much influenced by that. And you see that not only in his work, he later becomes a doctor, but towards, the kind of middle of his life, he does, publish extensively on folklore and myth, particularly one of his kind of enduring works, Irish Popular Superstitions, and when he does move towards the end of his life to the west of Ireland, he does very much speak about the different environs that he meets there, Loch Corrib, things like that. But moving on towards kind of his kind of middle years, he does become a fairly well-renowned eye and ear surgeon, and I would say probably the crowning achievement is the work that he does on the 1851 Irish census. And I know Christine has done kind of a lot of work on the Irish census, particularly the 1851 Irish census, in that it did do a lot of important work for detailing the famine, which was at that point still ongoing in Ireland. So one of the questions I have is, why was the census so important for this particular moment, and his work, which he was, eventually in 1864 knighted for. So Christine, I don't know if you want to join in just to discuss. You are our resident famine expert, but just to maybe briefly speak about the 1851 census.
Yeah, so this sketch, I hope you can all see it, is of William in 1847. And for Irish people, we remember 1847 as Black 47, probably the worst year of the terrible tragedy known as the Great Famine or the Great Hunger. And one of the sad things about it is the British government, who controlled Ireland at the time, didn't keep any proper records of death. So we don't know precise numbers of people who died. We certainly don't know the names of people who died, just to add to their lack of dignity. So for historians like myself, we have to use the censuses. There were censuses every 10 years in Ireland. There was one in 1841 and one in 1851. And we use them as a rough guide to say how many people died, what they died of, etc. And if you've read anything about the famine, we generally talk in large statistics. We say, well, about 1 million people died, 1.5 million people emigrated in the space of 6 years. In some ways, it does those people a disservice by making them so anonymous. But the fact we even have those sort of levels of insight are really due to the work of William Wilde. He was involved to a small extent in the 1841 census and the 1861 census, but it's the 1851 census, the post-famine census, although, as Matthew said, when does the famine really end? He made his mark. And he not only kept the statistics, he produced a table of deaths. And in it, he looked at earlier periods of famine. And again, as an Irish historian, it's just shocking to see that every generation of people in Ireland under the time of British rule, which dated back to the 12th century, underwent local subsistence crises. So I think with that, we'll hand over to Jarlath. So I'd like to welcome Jarlath Conroy to the programme. Jarlath is very well known in the Irish theatre, in film, television, and you're award-winning. So Jarlath, you're going to read some of William's words about the famine.
The great convulsion which Irish society of all grades here has lately experienced, the failure of the potato crop, pestilence, famine, and a most unparalleled extent of immigration, together with bankrupt landlords, pauperizing poor laws, grinding officials, and decimating workhouses, have broken up the very foundations of social intercourse, have swept away the established theories of political economists, and uprooted many of our long-cherished opinions. In some places, all the domestic usages of life have been outraged. The tenderest bonds of kindred have been severed. Some of the noblest and holiest feelings of human nature have been blotted from the heart. And many of the finest yet firmest links which united the various classes of the community have been rudely burst asunder. Even the ceremonial of religion has been neglected, and the very rites of sepulture, the most sacred and enduring of all of the tributes of affection or respect, have been neglected or forgotten. The dead body has rotted where it fell, or formed a scanty meal for the famished dogs of the vicinity, or has been thrown without prayer or mourning into the adjoining ditch. The hum of the spinning wheel has long since ceased to form an accompaniment to the colleen song, and that song itself, so sweet and fresh in the cabin, field, or byre, has scarcely left an echo in our glens, or among the hamlets of our land. The Shanachie and the Calla in the chimney corner tell no more the tales and legends of other days. Oh, unwaked, unkeened, the dead are buried where Christian burial has at all been observed, and the ear no longer catches the mournful cadence of the wild Irish cry, wailing on the blast, rising up to us from the valleys or floating along the winding river, when the skies, the fountains, every region near seemed all one mutual cry.
Thank you, Jarlath. And I think, sorry, that gives an insight onto the impact of the famine on individuals, on communities, and how it really, in the words of one survivor, changed everything. Music, poetry, and dancing died. Nothing was ever the same again. So that's a very poignant look at those tragic years. So, to a happier thought. William, in 1851, married an amazing woman who we're going to look at next week, Jane Elgee, better known by her pen name Speranza, a poet and a nationalist. They got married in Dublin. It seems to have been a happy marriage, and they had 3 children: William Charles Kingsbury Wilde, Oscar Fingal O'Flaherty Wills Wilde, and Isola Francesca Emily Wilde. Oscar was born actually on Westland Row, but when he was a small boy, the family moved to Merrion Square. So this might be a good opportunity to introduce you to our very special guest today. Clodagh, you are very, very welcome. And if I could just say a few words about you. Clodagh is Irish born, but New York based. She's a designer who has always been ahead of the curve with eco-friendly designs since she began her career. Clodagh is acclaimed for her life-enhancing minimalism and her wellness by design tenets. And importantly for today, Clodagh grew up in the summer home of the Wilde family, Moytura House in County Mayo. The landscape of Mayo has had a profound effect on your work. Clodagh, would you like to explain that?
Get rid of all this grass, put some bark mulch.
Whoops.
It's almost impossible to grasp the effect that the landscape and the people had on me.
Okay.
People were very kind. They were wonderfully kind. They were incredibly superstitious. When I was growing up there in my nursery, we were scared to walk out in the dark because of the banshees and the pukas and the and all the people out there who would take our bodies or put us in a fairy ring, where if we lay down in a fairy ring, and we would be whisked away to some remote place. So we lived with a lot of fear. The peacocks walked up the lawns at Moytura. And we were children. We had little raisins in our hands for them. We were terrified they'd peck us, but they actually took them quite gently. We were told to give them. But you could not take a peacock's feather into the house. They would be screaming because the peacock's feather announces a pending death. So it was laced with color, the jellies and jams in the pantry, the rolling hills and the lake. We lived a lot on the lake. We'd go out with, my father bred dogs. So we'd go out with about 20 dogs swimming behind the boat. And we'd have a picnic in our boat, and we'd land on an island, and the dogs would get out of the boat, and there is no friendlier animal than a wet dog, as most of you know. They shake themselves all over us. And we'd light a little fire, and my dad would go out in the boat and bring back fish. And we brought a frying pan so the fish would be fried and served. So it was all everything was very intertwined. We were very close to the land. Not funny here, but I was a wild child. I didn't like wearing shoes. None of us did. My brother, who was older than me, was fascinated by Oscar. And as soon as I was old enough to actually think about it, he gave me the epigrams of Oscar Wilde. So we would expound to each other. We would say the words of Oscar, and on the nursery window, Oscar had scratched his mother's name, his initials, and his initials with a diamond ring. I went back there in 2017, and alas, the glass had gone, but it was always there in my mind.
So it sounds.
We were the children of older parents, and we were to be seen and not heard. So we made our lives running wild, again wild, everything's about wild, and picking blackberries and just and studying madly, because that was the thing then, that you studied at home. And it's affected me very deeply, because I have something in my design between my ears, which is I call now my toolbox, which is what made it very easy for me to accept feng shui and biogeometry and all these healing and slightly mystic arts, because I was brought up that way. So I kind of owned them. Do you want me to read the letter, Oscar's letter?
Yeah. So we have a letter written by Oscar when he was actually down in Moytura House. So that would be fantastic if you could read it, please, Clodagh.
I can do that. It's written to Reginald Harding, nicknamed Kitten, sent from Moytura House on August 1876. Dear Kitten, have you fallen into a well or been mislaid anywhere that you never write to me? Or has one of your 9 lives gone? Frank Miles and I came down here last week and have had a very royal time of it sailing. We're at the top of Corrib, which if you refer to your geography, you will find to be a lake 30 miles long, 10 broad, and situated in the most romantic scenery in Ireland. Frank has done some wonderful sunsets since he came down. He has given me some more of his drawings. On Friday, we go into Connemara to a charming little fishing lodge we have in the mountains, where I hope to make him land a salmon and kill a brace of grouse. I hope to have very good sport indeed this season. Write to me there if your claws are not being clipped. Best to Puss, I hope he's reading hard. Ever yours, Oscar Fingal O'Flaherty Wills Wilde.
And this is a recently discovered photograph of Oscar in the local Ashford Castle. Would you like to talk about this, or Ashford Castle, Clodagh?
Ashford Castle was down the lake from us, and when we were living in Moytura, it was owned by the Guinness family. It was not a hotel.
Okay.
And for me, it was the height of glamour. It was, again, very influential, just the height of glamour. It's 800 years old, I think, the castle. And it was furnished with really rich textiles, lovely Asian rugs and Oriental rugs that had come from all over the place. And it's really engraved in my brain. It's been a huge influence in my life. Just that the changing light and shadow in County Mayo has influenced my lighting programs, because now I light with shadow. I don't light like hospital corridors.
And you have another connection, maybe two, with Oscar, Portora School.
Well, I don't have the connection to Portora myself because I'm a girl. No, my brother went to Portora Royal School, as it was called. Very glamorous place indeed. And I think that the interesting thing of being a child is declaiming literature, you know, making puns, making jokes, and always reading. We were always reading a book. And Portora, when my brother came down, of course, we got on very well together. My sister and myself was not quite such a good deal. No. But it's affected me because when I'm designing, I actually write what I call the narrative of what I'm going to design before I start sketching. So it's there in writing, and then, as it were, the book becomes a movie.
Okay. Well, Clodagh, thank you for now. That was fascinating, and I think a unique insight into part of Oscar's childhood. And another insight into his childhood, as we said, he attended Portora School in the north of Ireland, a school that was established in the early 17th century. He and his brother Willie were boarders there. And we now have a reading by Jenny, which is a letter that Oscar sent to his mother.
Darling Mama, the hamper came today. I never got such a jolly surprise. Many thanks for it. It was more than kind for you to think of it. The pears and grapes are delicious and so cooling, but the blancmange got a little sour, I suppose by knocking about, but the rest all came safe. The flannel shirts you sent in the hamper are both Willie's. Mine are one quite scarlet and the other lilac, but it is too hot to wear them yet. The weather is so hot. You may imagine my delight this morning when I got Papa's letter saying he had sent a hamper. Now, dear Mamma, I must bid you goodbye as the post goes very soon. Many thanks for letting me paint. With love to Papa, ever your affectionate son, Oscar Wilde.
Thank you, Jenny. So wouldn't you love to know what Papa sent in his hamper? Lucky Oscar. Matthew, would you like to say anything about Oscar's early school days or education?
Yeah, you know, he, going back, I think, from just looking at the perspective of his family, and I think their effect on him, thinking of him not only growing up in Portora as he was a teenager, but his days in Dublin. You know, one of the fascinating things about his family is that they just seemed to have the gift of gab. They were very much talkers, and you know, his mother and father had salons, and you know, and there's, you know, biographers and others who have kind of done research on just the way that he's always kind of established himself as a talker. As you get to his London days in the 1880s and 90s, you know, he was this wit, this, you know, this dandy, and that seems to be very much, you know, kind of in him, in his family, and from a kind of very early age, and again beginning at school, and places like that, and again even looking at that kind of connection that he had not only to Dublin, but I think also to the west coast, to the west of Ireland. I've done, you know, just a bit of research just looking at some of the early kind of historical and anthropological references that he makes in his early works, beginning with one that he wrote when he was in Oxford, The Rise of Historical Criticism, and again even in the kind of later piece, The Decay of Lying, where he, you know, he references the Renaissance and the way that they look at kind of antiquarianism and things like that. So it does seem that there is this kind of very interesting connection on two fronts of this kind of cosmopolitanism of Dublin, but also the west of Ireland, and this kind of you know, attraction to myth, you know, to superstition and things like that. And then you definitely see that, I think, from his father, and particularly that kind of, you know, early, you could kind of call it, I guess, a Celtic revival. I think that's something that's, at least in my studies, I think left out of a lot of the 19th century, is that you tend to think of Yeats and the kind of later Irish revivalists in the 1890s, early 20th century, as kind of jump-starting this connection to Irish myth and folklore and things like that, but really it was happening much earlier. You go back to the 20s, 30s, and 40s in particular, with the rise of young Ireland, and we'll talk more about this next week when we look at Lady Wilde, Speranza, and her connections to the Young Ireland movement. But again, you see it, I think, in particularly in his father's writing as well, as we've shown, and again, in his writings like Irish popular superstitions and things like that. So.
Okay, thank you, Matthew. So we are going to look at Irish popular superstitions next, but can I just remind you, if you would like to ask us a question, any of our panels, please use the chat button function. Thank you. So, Matthew mentioned Irish popular superstitions. Again, if you haven't read it, it is a fantastic read. Resonates very much with what Claude said about the west of Ireland, the light, the shade, the superstitions, the wildness, almost a sense of timelessness. So, Jarlath, would you like to read a section of it, please?
A wild and daring spirit of adventure, a love of legendary romance, a deep-rooted belief in the supernatural, an unconquerable reverence for ancient customs, and an extensive superstitious creed has, from the earliest times, belonged to the Celtic race. We cannot therefore wonder that among the but partially civilized, because neglected and uneducated, yet withal chivalrous inhabitants of a large portion of Ireland, a belief in the marvellous should linger even to the present day. It is, however, rapidly becoming obliterated, never to return. When now I inquire after the old farmer who conducted me in former years to the ruined castle or abbey and told me the story of its early history and inhabitants, I hear that he died during the famine. On asking for the peasant who used to sit with me in the ancient rath and recite the fairy legends of the locality, the answer is, he has gone to America. And the old woman who took me to the Blessed Well and gave me an account of its wondrous cures and charms, where is she? Living in the workhouse. These legendary tales and popular superstitions have now become the history of the past.
Thank you. Again, a very poignant reminder that the famine just didn't kill people alone. It really wiped out part of their culture and their language. So thank you, that was very beautiful. Just if I can quote from this book, in one place, Wilde says that these myths, legends, rites, and folklore were the poetry of the people. So how beautiful is that? Matthew, do you want to talk a bit about what it meant to Irish identity to rediscover these ancient folklores?
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because there's a whole, I think, again, I've forgotten, maybe not so much now, but there was, at least initially, in the kind of late 18th century into the early 19th century, where this kind of antiquarianism movement, began, at least in literature. The name that everyone was reading and everyone was kind of researching was James Macpherson and his poetry on, I always butcher this name, so Christine, help me out. I think Oisin, is that how you pronounce it?
Yeah, that works.
Which later actually turned out not to be true. Like, Macpherson had essentially messed with them, but that did not stop others, particularly in England, Scotland, and Ireland. Again, Ireland tends to get, I think, lost in a lot of 19th century historians or 19th century history novelists and things like that. I'm thinking obviously of Walter Scott and people like that, but in Ireland in particular, there was this, as I mentioned earlier, this kind of resurgence in Ireland, in the kind of Irish language and in Irish myth and folklore. At the same time, and Christine could speak more to this, there were major changes happening within Ireland in the 19th century in terms of education reforms, that it was essentially doing away with, Irish language, speaking Gaelic, essentially, the Act of Union that disproportionately affected Ireland and its relationship to England and Britain more fully. And it's kind of remarkable that even with all of these things kind of impeding this kind of look backwards and the importance of, again, keeping myth alive, not only in terms of for kind of a literary history, but for kind of a nationalist history, I think is really important. And I think you see that in Wilde's parents, people like William Wilde, and especially with Speranza, Jane Elgie, as she was, her maiden name. So yeah, I don't know if Christine, you want to speak a bit more about maybe the Act of Union, or maybe more of the historical. I kind of gave it a nice overview,
Yeah.
but.
We talked about Ireland being a colony, and in 1800, in the wake of 1798 rebellion, Ireland lost its own parliament and was governed from London. And this had a number of consequences. The decline of Dublin was one of them, but it also meant that during the famine, Ireland was governed from a foreign power that was not even in the country, and that had pretty disastrous impact. So I think we're going to explore some of these issues next week when we look at Speranza, because Speranza was a member of Young Ireland, a group formed in the 1840s to actually instill in Irish people a sense of pride in being Irish and give them a knowledge of history, because, as you say, the education system taught them about British poets, about British history, about the empire. So where were they going to learn about their own rich history and traditions? So it was very important. And as you say, it didn't begin with Yeats. It came far earlier. And the Wilde parents were in the front and center of what was happening. So very, very important. So Tello, have we any questions at this point?
We do. We have a few. I think here's a good one for Matt from Jeffrey's iPad. Matt, why did Wilde go to Oxford rather than Trinity?
Yeah, he actually, he started at Trinity, actually, and then he later went to Oxford. So he kind of did both. I think with someone like Wilde, there was this, I don't know, a kind of permeability between, Irish and English, and there was this this kind of great, attraction to London, obviously, as the kind of one of the central capitals, if not the central capital of the world. So there was a kind of, I would say, a kind of attraction there. But also, given Wilde's history of, not only kind of Irish history, but he was very much schooled in English history. I mean, he read, people like Byron and Shelley and Keats, and was very much influenced. And you see that kind of in his early poetry. But at the same time, even though as he was there and throughout his life, he was always, reminded repeatedly of his Irish upbringing and his Irish background. I think there was a quote somewhere that I think it's from Shaw, that he said he was more, he was more, oh God, I'm messing up the quote, but he was more English than the a very Irish Irishman is what he said. But there have been, readings as to why, his relationship to England. And I think it wasn't, a kind of either or. I think there was, given, his kind of relationship to not only his home, but I think to, kind of life in general. He very much wanted to be this kind of cosmopolitan figure. At the same time, he was, again, still very much Irish. And even as you look back and see some of the cartoons that were done of him, and some of the early, the stories that were done up of him, there was this kind of reactionary force, I think, in London and the newspapers, to essentially, kind of distance himself from being too English, that, a reminder that he was himself an Irishman. So, yeah.
Yeah, actually, that was a question for Christine as well. because Sir William Wilde was knighted, were they considered an Irish family or an English family?
Okay, and the very next slide is William Wilde being knighted, so that's very prescient. He was knighted at the beginning of 1864, mostly for his work on the census. And I think, as Matthew was saying, some of these categories were more porous at the time. So even though, and Speranza, again, we're coming to her more next week, but even though she, in the 1840s, agitated for Irish independence, she actually relished being Lady Jane Wilde. So there seems to be that ambiguity. So I think the borders weren't as rigid as we might want to retrospectively put on them. But I think if you read their writings, both private and public, you just have to say these people are Irish. They are Irish, you know, to their core. And later in life, Oscar would really get very frustrated with being in England. And at one point, he felt he should move to France. Oscar, like his mother, was a very talented linguist. They both spoke at least 6 or 7 languages, including Greek and Latin. So in one sense, Oscar would have been, he was very, as Matthew says, debonair, cosmopolitan. He could have been home anywhere. And so I think the way in which we are defining people wasn't quite so rigid at the time.
Right. A question for Clodagh. When we announced that we were doing this program, one of our people in the diplomatic service actually said, you know, in Dublin in the 60s, it wasn't enough for Dublin women to want to wear Clodagh's fashions. It's they wanted to be Clodagh. And Clodagh, when did you make the switch from fashion design into architectural design? Or why did you make the switch?
I changed husbands, countries, and careers is what I did. No. I went to live in Spain to give up the fashion. Married the man, and when he came to New York, I followed him. So I started in Spain. The architectural and interior started in Spain. So nomad. No.
I read somewhere that your first assignment was an Irish pub in Spain.
Yes, it was. And of course, I'm very familiar with pubs, so I was able to fulfill my first job very easily. And I got a lot of work after that, hotels and stuff like that in the south of Spain. And then came to New York. But Moytura came with me. As I said, I was there in 2017, and it's the inner video we all carry is very laden with the Moytura side. And I also went later to live in Yeats' uncle's house, so I was following the poets and writers.
Yeah.
So I've never specialized in anything.
That sounds like another program, the Yeats program. Christine, I got a question. Somebody asked, was Sir William Gregory, the husband of the playwright Lady Gregory, was he a contemporary of William Wilde? And what was the Gregory clause?
Yeah, so William Gregory, he was a landowner in County Galway, and they were contemporaries. They probably knew each other. They would have moved in Dublin castle circles in Dublin, maybe in the west of Ireland. They attended parties in Ashford Castle. But again, for anyone familiar with the Famine, William Gregory, he's not quite Charles Trevelyan, but he's somebody who is not seen as being sympathetic to the Irish poor in any way, shape or form. And why we remember him is in 1847, at the height of the Great Hunger, the British government introduced some new legislation. And an essential part of that legislation was the so-called Gregory Clause, introduced by Sir William Gregory, which deemed that no person who occupied more than 1/4 of an acre of land could receive any form of relief. And it meant that people who'd held onto their land for 2 years, despite everything, now were forced to give up their small holdings and go into the workhouses, emigrate, or simply die. So William Gregory is not remembered for very good reasons in Ireland.
Okay, well, if you want to go back now to the program, I think that's
We will, and I just wanted to say, when Clodagh was speaking about her fascinating career, something that Oscar was at the forefront of was the movement for dress reform. And to some extent, he was introduced by the woman who became his wife, Constance, but that was the part of aestheticism, that clothes should be comfortable and beautiful. So again, you're just a very different dimension to Oscar that links him with you again, Clodagh. So we've looked at Oscar's happy childhood, and now sadly things go wrong. This young woman, Mary Travis, claimed she'd had a relationship with William Wilde, and at one point she started to sell pamphlets in which she mocked the Wilde family. Speranza, Lady Wilde, being the forceful figure she was, actually wrote a letter of complaint to Mary Travis's father. It was very forceful. And so the family, the Travis family, sued the Wildes for libel. And this was at the end of 1864, the very year in which William Wilde had been knighted. Mary Travis won the case, but she was awarded a derisory 1 farthing. But to some extent, this very public humiliation broke the spirit of William Wilde. More tragedy came. Before William met Speranza, he had 3 children, 1 boy and 2 girls. Tragically, in 1871, the 2 daughters burned to death. They'd been to a ball, they came back home, one of the dresses caught fire, the other sister attempted to put the dress out and her dress caught fire, and so they both burned to death. So further tragedy. And a few years before that, Isola, who we met very briefly earlier, Oscar's little sister, died of fever. She was only 10 years old, and her death really broke the family's heart. This is the little Isola. And a few years later, William wrote a poem, maybe his first poem, which he dedicated to his now dead sister. And Jenny, would you please read the poem?
Tread lightly, she is near under the snow. Speak gently, she can hear the daisies grow. All her bright golden hair tarnished with rust. She that was young and fair, fallen to dust. Lily-like, white as snow, she hardly knew she was a woman, so sweetly she grew. Coffin bound, heavy stone, lie on her breast. I vex my heart alone, she is at rest. Peace, peace. She cannot hear lyre or sonnet. All my life's buried here, heap earth upon it.
Thank you. Very poignant poem to a now dead sister. And this is a spoiler alert, but you may know Oscar died in exile in Paris in 1900. And amongst his small number of possessions, they found this envelope, which is a tribute to Isola. And in the envelope, there was a lock of his sister's hair. So through whatever Oscar had been through, he kept the tender memory of his sister alive. So, William, back to William. This is a photograph of him with an unidentified female. This is later in life. Following the deaths, following the public court scandal, William retired to Moytura. In some ways, a broken man. And William died in 1876, and he was buried in St. Jerome Cemetery in Dublin. Sadly, at this stage, his finances were not good, and so Moytura House and the house in Merrion Square were sold. So, before we move on to conclusion, any more questions, Tolo?
Yes, I had one question from Jeff, who asked, did Oscar himself write anything about the Great Hunger?
Will I answer that? We and Matthew and I have talked about this quite a bit, and Matthew might come in a bit later on. He spoke about it a lot indirectly. He spoke about the house in which he grew up was surrounded by blue books about the famine. Blue books are parliamentary papers which his father would have contributed to in the census. He refers to things and Matthew will know this better, his first play, Vera, which was never very successful. He talks about a blight, which is a really interesting use of a word, and especially, again, when we think of the famine, we'll immediately think of blight. And he talked about the famine in terms of Ireland not being independent. And at one point, and this is my turn to butcher up a quote, he talked about the English came and they despoiled our land. We took their language and we made it more beautiful. So he was very much aware of that colonial context in which he was surviving, and of the famine that had occurred, but really which mostly affected his parents. Oscar was born 1854, so in some ways he was a child of the famine, but not immediately involved.
Yeah, and I think just to reiterate what Christine had said again, there's no, I think, direct reference to famine in any of his works, but I've done a few things, as Christine mentioned. One of his first plays in 1881 was Vera, and it's modeled largely, it seems, on a figure like his mother, this kind of revolutionary figure. He places it within Russia at the time, which again everyone expected would be a kind of safe bet, but as it was premiered, and this is kind of humorous, but also kind of darkly humorous. There was a kind of coup in Russia, and the emperor was assassinated, which again kind of forced the play itself to kind of have a very short run. But again, even throughout his life, he did seem to have connections when he goes to America, which again will be I think in 2 weeks, we'll be talking more about the 1882 trip to America. He does repeatedly, kind of discuss his mother and the kind of the nationalists of 1840, his mother included. He gives a fairly now famous speech in San Francisco where he talks about Speranza and John Mitchell and people like that, and we'll talk more about that in a few weeks. But there did seem to be a connection that even his mother had in the 1880s as land reform was happening and things like that, that they very much were up to date on current events, and again, he does have interesting parallels with Charles Stewart Parnell, who again was a major figure for Ireland at that time. So again, it's a kind of very interesting family, and Wilde being Wilde, he never makes anything easy. I think he kind of intersperses references throughout some of his works. So yeah.
Okay, any more questions?
Yeah, Christine, we got a question asking, was the city of Dublin affected by the famine as other parts of Ireland was?
Yeah, so one of the tragedies of the famine is that no part of Ireland escaped. Every part was affected, including the northeast. There used to be a myth, fake news, that the northeast wasn't affected, but it was. Protestants died if they were poor. So the cities suffered because during any food shortage or any epidemic, historically, people would pour into the cities and they'd come in looking for work, looking for relief, maybe looking to emigrate. And so they put a tremendous strain on cities that were already in decline and already had a lot of poverty. And in Cork City, for example, the city authorities wanted to have people patrolling around to keep paupers out. They were afraid that these people would spread disease, and we are now living with similar fears in some ways of people getting too close, of overcrowding. So Dublin certainly did suffer, and this is it was something I came across quite recently, and I thought it was interesting. You've all heard of Guinness. So at the time of the famine, Guinness too was in control, and he was actually an evangelical, and he gave some donations during the famine, some to Galway and some to the city of Dublin, but he gave donations so that people could proselytize. In Ireland we talk about souperism. So even in Dublin during the Great Hunger there was souperism, sadly funded by the Guinness family. So I want to thank a few people, and if we have time for more questions. So this is our magnificent team: Becky Abbott, Anne-Marie Godbert, me, Kieran Luke, Hello, Matthew, Tad, John Walsh, and a real special thanks to all of our guests. Don't leave us yet, though. And just I want to say thank you to CT Humanities and to Great Hunger Institute at Quinnipiac University who made this possible. And next week, we have a very special guest who you might recognise, Paul Muldoon, who has published over 30 collections and has won the Pulitzer Prize and the T.S. Eliot Prize for poetry. And as we're speaking about Speranza, Oscar's mother, who was a poet, it seems particularly appropriate that we should have him as a guest. So before we sign out, any final questions?
Yeah, could I say something? Maureen Murphy here.
Hey, Maureen.
I'm the black. I don't have a camera, so I'm the black thing that says admin. I wanted to say something more about Wilde and the 1851 census, and one thing which has a final irony between Sir William and Oscar. You know, he was an ophthalmic surgeon. He was very interested in deaf and dumb population in Ireland, and so he documented the frequent occurrence of ophthalmia in Tipperary and Athlone and workhouse populations. And he talked about the high incidence of blindness, and particularly the question of deafness. And at the end of Oscar's life, remember he was born when Sir William had written the Practical Observations of Oral Surgery and Nature and Treatment of the Diseases of the Ear. And when he was released from prison, this is Oscar now, from Reading Jail for gross indecency, he was suffering from deafness in his right ear as a result of an abscess that had perforated his eardrum. And he had another episode of chronic ear infection, and surgery failed to cure the condition. In the following months, he was diagnosed with a mental disturbance caused by a long-standing suppuration of the right ear. So it's a kind of interesting connection. That 1851 census, very, very focused on diseases, very focused on, and the most useful part, on the deaf and dumb population of Ireland. And at the end of Oscar's life, he comes back to having these kind of ear conditions that his father would have treated in his active life as a doctor.
Okay, thank you.
Christina, I have another question here. One of our very sort of avid viewers noticed an Emmy Award behind you on your shelf. They want to know, what did you win an Emmy for?
Okay, it's real. It's not made of chocolate or anything. I won it in conjunction with my very good friend and colleague from Quinnipiac University, Rebecca Abbott, who has helped us put this together. And Rebecca made a really very poignant and beautiful documentary about the Great Hunger and the diaspora. I think it's on Vimeo, and you can get the details if you email us or on our website. And so it's actually, we got it 3 years ago. I was in Ireland, my daughter was getting married in Ireland, and Becky came to the wedding and she flew back the next day because of the award ceremony. And when I woke up the next morning, I had a text saying, I have a little statue for you.
Oh, that's great.
That was it. It was very nice. So and let me just say, I'm a historian. I write books, I teach, I walk my dog. I in my life never thought I would win an Emmy, so to have one, and you know, I'm deeply grateful to Becky because she made me look good. So thank you, Becky.
Christine, we have a few minutes here.
Yes.
And somebody asked if you could just give us, what are the next 5 programs about?
Okay. Oh, can I go back to the beginning? Would that be ugly?
Yeah, just skip that.
Yeah. Okay, so next week is Speranza's Gifted Son. So we're going to look at Speranza and see Oscar through the prism of his mother, and we'll talk more about her nationalism, her writings, which have sort of fallen out of fashion, and her poetry. And I'm sure Paul Muldoon will have some very interesting things to say on that. Wednesday, June the 10th, is the first pop invasion, and it's Wilde in America. Matthew briefly referred to Oscar going to America in 1882. And the images we see of Oscar, you see one there of this young man with lank, limp hair. They all came about from his time in America, so we'll talk about that. And I have argued in some of my writings that in America, Oscar reconnected with his Irishness. Week 4 is Stages and Pages, Wilde's Words and Wisdom. Where do you begin, where do you end? He has written so much, but we're going to dip into some of his multiple, diverse, beautiful writings. Then it gets a bit darker. Gross Indecencies, June the 24th. It's Wilde's trial, imprisonment, and death in exile. And you've heard from Maureen Murphy some of the sad circumstances of his death in exile. We'll look at that. And then we finish, I hope, on a high note. We're looking at Still Wilde. Clodagh spoke very well about being still Wilde. The legacies of Oscar Wilde, and how each generation seems to rediscover Oscar and fall in love with Oscar. How does he do it? So they are our programs.
Right. I think I'll give the last word from my end to Jeffrey, who said that about your Emmy, it would have been more appropriate to win an Oscar. But, but congratulations and thank you for the presentation.
Oh, that's really funny. Thank you. Thank you. And if you need more information, we have a lovely website with information on some poetry, etc. I'll read it again. GO full stop QU full stop EDU stroke Wilde. So all I can say is thank you all for joining us. Thank you to Turlo for keeping us in check. Thank you to my co-curator, Matthew, and really great thanks to Jarlath and Jenny, who read so beautifully. It really, breathed living feeling into it. It was wonderful. And special thanks to Clodagh, who shared really a unique insight into Oscar Wilde and his family. So thank you all. Thank you everyone who joined us, and we hope to see you all next week. Be safe. Bye now.